Attachment is the root of suffering. Buddha Thean sat quietly in the corner of the bustling family home, his cane resting against the arm of his chair. Around him, his son's family moved about with the hurried energy of modern life, voices rising, plates clattering, and the hum of a television filling the air. Yet, in the midst of this activity, Thien felt an emptiness that no noise could mask. Years earlier, Thien had dreamed of this phase of life. He imagined evenings spent telling stories to his grandchildren, mornings sipping tea with his son, and an unspoken harmony between generations. Yet, reality had proved different. His daughter-in-law's smiles were thin and perfunctory, her words tinged with an irritation she tried and often failed to conceal. His grandchildren barely looked up from their screens to greet him, and his son, always busy, rarely shared more than a brief conversation. One evening, Thien overheard his daughter-in-law complaining to her husband. "He's old, yes, but does he need to be here all the time? We have our own lives, our own needs. It's exhausting." Her words pierced him. He wasn't angry. He understood that life had its pressures, but the realization settled heavily in his chest. He was no longer the father who provided or the pillar who held the family steady. Instead, he had become an obligation, a weight they silently bore. Sitting on the veranda that night, watching the moon cast its light across the courtyard, Thien reflected on his feelings. The wind carried the faint scent of jasmine, a reminder of the days when he and his late wife had planted the flowers together. He whispered softly to himself, "This is impermanence. Nothing lasts, not love, not youth, not even family." For a moment, his heart ached, but he caught himself. He remembered the Buddhist teachings. Dukkha suffering arises from attachment. Hadn't he clung too tightly to the idea of family, imagining it as an eternal refuge? He realized that his expectations had chained him to a fleeting reality. The next morning, Thien began to change. He no longer waited for his son's attention or hoped for his daughter-in-law's approval. Instead, he focused on his own well-being. He joined a local meditation group, spending his mornings in quiet contemplation. In the afternoons, he walked to the temple to offer incense and prayers, finding solace in the rhythm of spiritual practice. Lesson: dependence on others, even family, can lead to disillusionment. As the Buddha taught, everything in life is transient. By letting go of expectations and seeking peace within, we free ourselves from the pain of unmet desires. To keep the body in good health is a duty. Otherwise, we shall not be able to keep our mind strong and clear. Buddha at 68, Lin felt the weight of years pressing on her body. Once vibrant and active, she now struggled to rise from bed without her knees protesting. Her back ached after standing too long, and the stairs in her daughter's home seemed steeper with every passing day. Lin had moved in with her daughter after her husband passed away, thinking it would bring comfort to both. At first, it was a harmonious arrangement. She cared for her grandchildren, cooked meals, and felt a sense of purpose. But over time, she noticed a shift. Her daughter, once warm and grateful, began to seem distant. The grandchildren grew impatient with her slow movements, and she overheard her son-in-law muttering about the costs of extra groceries. One afternoon, after a particularly sharp comment from her daughter about being a financial burden, Lin retreated to her room. She sat by the window, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. Tears welled in her eyes, not from anger, but from a profound sadness. Looking outside, she saw an old neighbor walking briskly down the street, her steps purposeful and her posture straight. Lin remembered that the woman, despite being older, had always maintained her health through daily exercise and a simple diet. Lin thought about her own choices, the fried snacks she enjoyed, the long hours sitting idle, and the way she'd ignored her body's warnings for years. That evening, Lin resolved to change. She began waking up early to stretch and meditate. Even if her joints protested at first, she replaced heavy, oily foods with fresh vegetables and soups. She also made time to walk in the nearby park, where the trees stood tall and unyielding, a reminder of nature's quiet strength. At first, the changes were small and challenging. Her legs felt stiff, and her breath came in short gasps, but Lin persisted. Slowly, she found that her energy returned. Her steps grew lighter, her aches diminished, and a newfound clarity settled over her mind. her daughter noticed the transformation. "Mother, you look stronger these days," she said one morning, her voice softer than it had been in months. Lynn smiled, not with pride, but with a quiet understanding. "I've learned to care for myself, my dear. It is the least I can do for myself and for those I love." Lesson: the body is a temple, and its care is a sacred duty. As the Buddha taught, physical health is essential for mental and spiritual clarity. By nurturing our bodies with mindfulness, we not only extend our lives, but also enhance the quality of each moment. Nothing is forever, except change. The quiet hum of a summer afternoon filled Min's home as he sat in his study, staring at a photo from years ago. It was a family portrait taken during a festive gathering. His children, then young and full of laughter, sat beside him, while his wife stood behind with a gentle smile. Now, the house was quiet, filled with luxury but devoid of the warmth he once cherished. Miyai had worked tirelessly throughout his life, ensuring that his children had every opportunity. He built a thriving business, purchased a grand home, and supported his family in every way possible. Yet, as the years passed, the bonds he thought were unbreakable began to fray. His children, now adults, rarely visited unless there was a financial matter to discuss. His wife had passed away years ago, leaving a void that even the finest material possessions could not fill. Minch often sat in his expansive living room, surrounded by silence, wondering where he had gone wrong. One day, an old friend, Deo, came to visit. Deo, in stark contrast, lived a simple life in a modest cottage. Despite this, he exuded a calm and contentment that puzzled me. "Deo," Min asked as they sipped tea, "you have so little compared to what I've built. How is it that you seem happier than me?" Deo smiled, his face serene. "Mine, you have misunderstood permanence. You built your happiness on things that were never meant to last: wealth, possessions, even relationships. These are like sandcastles, beautiful, but washed away by time. True joy comes from accepting the impermanence of life and finding peace within." The words lingered in Min's mind long after Dao left. He began to reflect on his life, realizing how much energy he had spent clinging to the illusion of control. Slowly, Minch made changes. He donated much of his wealth to causes he believed in, started volunteering at a local orphanage, and reconnected with old friends. Though his children still visited infrequently, he no longer felt bitterness. Instead, he cherished the moments they shared, however brief. Lesson: the Buddhist teachings on impermanence remind us to release attachment to the fleeting. Happiness cannot be built on transient things. It must come from acceptance and a deeper connection to life's truth. You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. Buddha Hoa sat by the window of her small apartment, watching the rain streak down the glass. It was a quiet evening, and her thoughts wandered to her younger years. Back then, her days were filled with the relentless demands of motherhood, household responsibilities, and the constant effort to meet everyone's needs. She had given everything: her time, her energy, and even her dreams for her family. Now, in her 60s, she realized she had little left for herself. Her children were grown, busy with their own lives. They loved her, but their visits were sporadic and often rushed. She didn't blame them. She had taught them to prioritize their responsibilities. But there was a growing void in her heart, a sense of being lost, unmoored from her own identity. One day, while visiting the local temple, Hoa listened to a monk speaking about compassion. "We often think of compassion as something we give to others," he said. "But how can we offer what we do not have? To truly love others, we must first love ourselves." His words struck a chord. Hoa realized she had spent her life pouring from an empty cup, neglecting her own needs and desires. Inspired, she decided to make a change, not to forsake her family, but to rediscover herself. She began with small steps. Waking early to meditate, journaling her thoughts, and taking long walks in the nearby park, she dusted off her old sketchbooks and began drawing again, an activity she had abandoned decades ago. At first, it felt selfish, even strange, to focus on herself. But as days turned into weeks, Hoa noticed a transformation. Her laughter returned. softer at first, then stronger. Her energy grew as she felt a renewed sense of purpose. When her children visited, they noticed the change. "Mom, you seem different, happier," her daughter remarked one afternoon. Hoa smiled, her eyes shining with quiet wisdom. "I've learned that taking care of myself doesn't mean I love you any less. It means I can love you better." Lesson: true compassion begins within. As the Buddha taught, self-love is not selfish. It is the foundation of a kind and giving heart. By nurturing ourselves, we not only heal but also grow our capacity to care for others. The trouble is, you think you have time. Buddha Nam was a beloved figure in his community. Despite his advancing age, his sharp wit and infectious humor made him a favorite at every gathering. But when he returned to his modest home each evening, an unfamiliar silence greeted him. His wife had passed years ago, and his children, though caring, were busy with their own lives. They called occasionally, sent gifts during the holidays, but their visits were rare and fleeting. One winter, during Tet, his eldest son's family came to visit. Nam had prepared days in advance, cleaning the house, cooking traditional dishes, and setting aside a special red envelope for each grandchild. When they arrived, the house came alive with chatter and laughter. Yet Nam noticed something, though they were physically present. Their attention was elsewhere. His son was glued to his phone. His daughter-in-law hurriedly worked on her laptop, and his grandchildren barely looked up from their tablets. Nam watched quietly as the gifts he had carefully chosen were opened with brief smiles before being set aside. That night, as he sat alone after they left, he felt an ache he hadn't known before. The gifts hadn't bridged the gap between them. The conversations had been surface level, hurried, and the moments he longed for the deep, heartfelt connections had slipped away like grains of sand. The next morning, Nam resolved to make a change. He decided to stop placing his hopes in material offerings and instead focus on creating meaningful moments. The next time his family visited, he didn't prepare elaborate gifts. Instead, he told stories from his youth, played simple games with his grandchildren, and shared wisdom through his anecdotes. The atmosphere shifted. His grandchildren began asking questions about his past, and his son laughed at a story he hadn't heard before. Later, as his youngest grandchild hugged him tightly and whispered, "I love your stories," Grandpa Nam realized he had found what he'd been missing. It wasn't the gifts, but the memories they created together that would last. Lesson: material possessions are fleeting, but shared experiences endure. The Buddha's teachings remind us that true value lies not in what we give, but in how we connect. Cherish each moment as a gift, for time is the only true currency we have. Let us rise up and be thankful, for if we didn't learn a lot today, at least we learned a little. Buddhalin had always been a pillar of strength. Widowed at a young age, she raised 3 children on her own, working tirelessly to provide for them. Now, in her late 72nd, she lived alone in the house she had built with her husband decades ago. Her children visited occasionally, but their lives were busy, filled with the responsibilities of work and family. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, a wave of loneliness washed over her. She thought of her children and grandchildren, of the bustling life her home once held. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Lan had learned through years of hardship that gratitude was her anchor. She thanked the sun for its warmth, the wind for its gentle caress, and the Buddha for each breath she took. She thanked the years she had spent with her husband and the joy of watching her children grow. Even in solitude, she found reasons to be grateful. Her practice of gratitude transformed her days. She found joy in the small things. The way the morning light filtered through the trees, the sound of birdsong, and the aroma of the jasmine tea she brewed every afternoon. When her neighbor's young daughter came to visit, Lan shared stories of resilience and hope, filling the child's heart with warmth and laughter. One day, her eldest son asked, "Mother, how do you stay so content despite everything?" Lan smiled, her face lined with years of wisdom. Contentment doesn't come from having everything we want. It comes from appreciating everything we have. Life is a gift, even with its sorrows. Her words stayed with her son, who began visiting more often, bringing his children to hear their grandmother's wisdom. Leon's home slowly regained some of its warmth, not because she had demanded their presence, but because her gratitude and acceptance inspired them to return. Lesson: gratitude is the foundation of a peaceful heart. As the Buddha taught, acceptance of life, as it is not as we wish it to be, frees us from suffering. By focusing on the blessings we have, we cultivate joy and resilience, even in the face of life's challenges. Aging is not a burden, but a profound opportunity for growth, reflection, and connection. Through the lens of Buddhist philosophy, we can navigate old age with wisdom and grace, finding peace in impermanence, strength in self-compassion, and joy in gratitude. The path may not be easy, but each step brings us closer to understanding the true essence of life. A heart filled with love, a mind free of attachment, and a spirit that finds contentment in the present moment.